Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to Russia in Context. It's been about a week and a half since the last time I gave you all a little Russia update, but I had to take care of some, personal matters here in the country. But now I'm ready to give you the full rundown, and good news is not too many major news stories. And in fact, the biggest news story is the most recent one, so we'll get right into that, and then we'll hit some of the smaller ones in a little bit. Now, the major news story has to deal with flooding in the Orenburgskaya Oblast. The epicenter at this point in time is the city of Orsk, although flooding is just happening generally in that whole region, that being Kurganskaya Oblast, Chelyabinskaya Oblast, Bashkiria, but even a little bit further away in Tyumenskaya Oblast as well. All of those regions have been declared a state of emergency. Now, what happened was levees burst. Levees burst and flooded the surrounding areas, and levees burst in multiple places. At first, it was just one place, but then it seems at this point in time, every single day since Saturday, there has been news of a levee bursting in at least one new location. So I think at this point in time, I've seen 5 different news stories about levee bursts, maybe 6, who knows. So obviously with the levees bursting, we are seeing thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of homes across the country in these areas being affected by floods. They are underwater, and obviously many times more people have been displaced by the rising water as well. However, I do want to focus on Orenburgskaya Oblast because it has been the hardest hit right now. Kurganskaya Oblast is also taking it, but Orenburgskaya Oblast is the worst off at this moment. And the handling of the situation there is perhaps a good example for us to look at of how not to handle a situation like this. So in the days leading up to the levee bursting, the local government did not tell people to evacuate. It did not give them any news that would cause them to alarm or even maybe prepare for an evacuation. In fact, they told them that everything was okay. The residents were only told to evacuate after the levee had already burst, which is pretty obvious. You probably should evacuate after a levee has burst. However, after the levee burst in other areas that had already been hit with floodwater, the government told people it was still safe to drink tap water. And then, surprise, surprise, the next day we had, not too many people, but still, we had cases of people going to the hospital with stomach infections because, massive surprise here, you can't drink tap water when there's flood water everywhere because there's literally shit in it. On the heels of all of that news, bottled water has run out in the area, although the central government here in Moscow has said that they are going to be shipping in mass quantities of it, as well as bread ran out because, why not? And there have been some cases of looting happening in the region, but for the most part, not really because it's early April, it's cold, and it's a flood. Now, one of the big scandals at this point in time has to do with the levee itself. Obviously, a levee collapsing is a massive problem that should never happen. Governments are supposed to, pay attention and make sure that they are in good condition. But the problem with the levee in this situation is it's kind of new. It was built 10 years ago for a price tag of about 1 billion rubles, which is, it's pricey. And it was just checked a few years back by engineers and given the okay, everything was good. Now, I have seen some explanations from experts connected to the construction company that it was rodents that actually hollowed out the inside of the levee with their tunnels and everything. So rats, I guess, and ground squirrels, according to the construction company's experts, are to blame for the levee bursting or collapsing. However, the more widespreadly accepted explanation is corruption. And I think that's probably the correct explanation. It would be not too hard to imagine that most of that 1 billion rubles didn't make it into the actual construction of the levee, but into pockets of officials at various levels. In fact, the reason that we can maybe suspect this is true is because this flooding, even though right now local governors and other politicians are saying that this is historic flooding, that this level of water hasn't been seen for 60 years or more, that might be the case, but this isn't the first disaster like this that Russia has seen in recent years. In fact, we've seen this in the last 2 years. Last year, it happened in Ussurisk, and in 2022 in Blagoveshchensk, both of those further east in Siberia. And again, in both of those situations, you had poorly constructed levees, which cost a boatload of money in the construction process, which collapsed under spring thaws, spring snowmelt. Blagoveshchensk is a kind of a fun example too, because it sits on the Chinese border, and the Chinese city on the other side, which I don't know the name of, they also were faced with floodwaters and things of that nature, but their levees held up just fine. One of the big questions I would say, though, that I have, according to all of this whole situation, is how did the authorities not know that something like this was probably going to happen? What I mean by that is, for the last probably about 2 or 3 weeks now in northwestern Kazakhstan, which Orenburg and those regions like Kurgans, they border with northwestern Kazakhstan. Anyway, in northwestern Kazakhstan, there has been massive flooding as well. And the massive flooding was brought on by snowmelt. So first of all, the governments can see that in the neighboring region and like right across the border, they're also fighting huge floods and they're having major problems with it. So it would seem pretty logical, since a lot of those rivers flow into each other in that region, that they should maybe, I don't know, prepare for it, let people know that it is possible that in the coming weeks you might need to evacuate your homes, that there might be a flood. But before all of that, how did the meteorologists not know this? Meteorologists love statistics, and if I'm not mistaken, they should have statistics for average snowfall or average precipitation in a given season, right? So they should have been able to see that over the winter, oh crap, we have 3 times as much snow as we normally do. This is probably going to be a problem when it melts. As far as I know, that didn't happen. There should have been some sort of forewarning, so it just seems like there was just a complete collapse, or maybe collapse is not the right word, just nobody was doing their jobs. Anyway, not to make light of a serious situation, the flood waters are actually expected to continue rising for the next few days. As of Sunday, April 7th, yesterday, the governor said that it probably would not be until the 10th, or maybe even a day or two later, that waters would begin to recede. However, I remember there being rain happening in that region as well recently, so it is possible that it might be even more delayed. Regardless, over the next half week at least, the situation is going to get worse, and according to experts in, hydrology, they figure it's going to be at least 2.5 to 3 weeks before the waters fully recede. Anyway, obviously this is kind of a breaking story, a long-term breaking story, but it is one that we are going to be coming back to in the near future as this situation continues to unfold. Now, the day before the levee burst near the city of Orsk, where the massive flooding is happening right now, the major news story was an attack on the mayor of the Murmanskaya Oblast up in the Russian Arctic. The governor, Andrei Chibis, was attacked by an angry constituent, I suppose, stabbed multiple times in the chest and stomach. Now, Chibis was immediately rushed to a hospital. He didn't have any life-threatening injuries, and he is expected to make a full recovery. The reaction to it, though, almost immediately from a number of writers on Telegram was to theorize how Ukraine was connected to this. And I realize that this is not directly connected to the stabbing itself. We're going to come back to that. But I do think it is a really good example of a trend that has emerged here in Russia over the last half a year or so. Obviously, it started before then, but has really picked up steam in the last half a year or so. That trend is to blame Ukraine for everything. Everything bad that happens in Russia nowadays has to somehow be connected to Ukraine. And it's been happening for so long now that it's almost becoming a joke. There's like a reason why a lot of people here in Russia have a hard time believing that Ukraine was connected to the terrorist attack, something that we're going to come back to. And it doesn't have to do simply with the fact that it's kind of illogical. It also has to do with the fact that the government blames Ukraine for everything. The boy who cried wolf, it's one of those situations. And while I'm not saying that Ukraine isn't responsible for some things that have happened here in Russia, just look at Daria Dugina or Prilepin, there have been attacks on individual figures here in Russia, typically using bombs, not, single dudes with knives. So I don't want to say that they're completely unjustified in being a little bit paranoid or a little bit worried about such attacks. But what I think is important is that by putting all of these attacks or any little bad thing that happens on Ukraine, it ultimately distracts or blinds them from potential real threats that could be coming from other directions. So going back to Chibis, let's talk about what one of those other directions might be. Because Chibis was meeting with, like I said, his constituents, and he walked outside, and somebody who, as we understand now, seems to have been quite upset with what he was doing in the oblast. They felt they had no other path of recourse but to attack him with a knife. And this might seem absurd, but when we look at what's happening in modern Russia with censorship, it becomes a little less nonsensical. See, here in Russia, as a lot of you probably know, expressing your discontent or your dislike for things connected to the government or the war, or even specific politicians can see you wind up with a massive fine or even potential jail time. And as the government here in Russia tightens the screws down little by little, people are left with fewer and fewer ways of expressing their distaste with policy or the dislike or their absolute loathing for certain things. So if, 6 years ago, people were able to go online and type out a big tirade on social media and see some other people agree with them and vent some steam in that regard, that is no longer a viable option because you're almost certainly going to either lose a lot of money or go to jail. And so as these screws tighten and people are no longer able to vent that steam, this is one of those potential sources of danger that the government is potentially ignoring. That is, frustrated individuals feel they have no other course of action but to resort to violent means. I don't want to say that this is going to happen large scale across the country, but it is something to keep in mind, and I think it's completely logical. This is not some sort of completely unimaginable scenario where people with no other way forward turn to the most extreme measures possible. Speaking of, I guess, extreme measures, if we want to call it that, the terrorist attack from the 22nd of March is still dominating the news cycle here, and for obvious reason. At this point in time, though, we are more into the investigation. And I want to go back to that Ukrainian thing and just how the Russian government is putting all of its focus on establishing a connection to Ukraine. Like, okay, fine, do what you want. But they're ignoring all of the other evidence, which is kind of odd. They've just completely ignored ISIS because it doesn't fit into the narrative. They're also ignoring the fact that the Russian FSB actually prevented a terrorist attack by the same ISIS-X group that took responsibility for the Crocus City Hall attack. They prevented a terrorist attack by that ISIS-X group a few months back, thanks to intel from the United States, actually. And some politicians have even gone so far as to say that the 4 Tajik nationals who are being accused of the crime had microchips implanted in their brains and that they were being controlled remotely, and that this was all some grand secret conspiracy to, I don't know, disrupt national unity. It's kind of gotten a little absurd. And I think there are people who believe the official narrative, but because, again, it's leaning heavy into the Ukraine is to blame for everything, there's no actual evidence that has been presented, and it doesn't really make sense if you think about it for more than 30 seconds. I don't know many people who have bought into it. So again, let's see. It's been 3 weeks now, and maybe the government is getting ready to publish some massive, really prize-winning investigative reporting, and then we'll all have the shutters removed from our eyes. If that's the case, that's fantastic. I am dying to hear it. But as it stands right now, the strongest evidence that we've gotten was that the 4 suspects, who again had been tortured when they were detained, and so it's probably not too wild to imagine that that may have continued in prison. The 4 suspects who, if you watch the videos when they were being detained, could barely speak Russian in most cases. All 4 of them have been filmed recently where they gave very, almost well-rehearsed, one might say, explanations that they were driving to Kiev and that they were going to cross the border into Ukraine, and that they were going to be paid 100,000 rubles when they got there. Now, this ignores a few questions such as, how are they going to get across the Russian side of the border? Even if Ukraine demined their own side of the border, there's still the Russian side of the border. And then there's the question of, why would they be paying them in rubles that are no good outside of Russia? And then, why would they drop their weapon? There's just a lot of questions. I'm not going to get into it. If you dig in, you can find it out there. Regardless, this whole week and a half, honestly, since the last time I've done one of these videos, the Russian government, in terms of investigation, had just been sort of leaking little tidbits that we found a connection to Ukraine and passing it off as news. About the terrorist attack itself, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but at this point in time, it pretty much is a situation where at a ratio of maybe 4 or 5 to 1, the vast majority of the deaths were caused by fire and asphyxiation. And this goes back to the actual investigation, the real investigation going on into Crocus City Hall itself, and as to why the fire systems were not working, why the building burnt so goddamn quickly, and why the people were not able to use fire escapes to get out in a reasonable, timely fashion. Now, the people who own the Crocus City Hall, the Agalarovs, are quite powerful, quite wealthy, quite influential. So we'll see how this plays out. But there have already been a number of people, not sentenced, but that have had charges leveled against them. So some of this might actually go to court, and I think that is going to be not the most interesting thing connected to this, but it will be interesting to see how that plays out. And then obviously, it began the week after the terrorist attack, but definitely continuing last week as well. The number of foreigners, specifically Central Asian migrant workers who were rounded up by police, just increased dramatically, which is fair. That would happen in pretty much any country. And they were checking documents, everything like that. But what is interesting is last week in Dagestan, which is in the far Russian south in the Caucasus Mountain region, there was a counter-terrorism operation in which Russian counterterrorism forces rooted out 5 or 6 Tajik nationals who were connected to ISIS and who had weapons and things of that nature, who looked to be planning another terrorist attack. Again, ISIS, Tajik nationals, literally the exact same thing that we saw the 22nd of March, but I guess Ukraine. Anywho, I know this has been kind of long and rambling about what's happened after the terrorist attack, but that's kind of how it's felt. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, it was this slow drip feed of pieces of information, and none of it really means anything. So it's just this kind of watery, washed out mess in my mind, and I'm assuming in the minds of most people. Maybe that's done intentionally so that there is no clear picture, because honestly, there is no clear picture at this point in time. There is the official version, which is, again, for the umpteenth time, Ukraine is responsible, but we don't really have any clear evidence to show how. And then there is the ISIS took responsibility, published videos from inside the attack, seemed pretty clearly motivated. Let's move on from this topic. Actually, before we move on to this, let's talk about something terrorist adjacent, and that is the Taliban. And the Taliban, I don't know if they're actually responsible for any clear terrorist attacks, but again, terrorist adjacent works just fine here. And currently, the Taliban is a prohibited organization here in Russia, but Russia seems to be warming up to them, and there are whispers that Russia is going to take them off the prohibited organizations list and actually recognize them as the formal government of Afghanistan. Okay, fine. The latter part, sure, right? You know, those are the realities on the ground. As to why they're doing this, explanations tend to be a little bit more conspiratorial. What I do find interesting is that Russia is leaning really heavy to this idea of traditional family values. Okay. The Taliban, as far as I remember, practice doing not good things with children. An example of this that I can kind of mention on YouTube without, I think, getting in trouble would be child marriage and all the things that come with child marriage. So I'm not really sure how traditional family values and child marriage and other bad things with children that the Taliban is well known for doing, I'm not really sure how those two things fit together, but evidently they do for the Russian government. Now, I mentioned how migrant workers were being rounded up and documents checked, people being sent out of the country, deported, but this right now has also become the hot topic, which is immigration. And I think it's important to highlight that here in Russia, the Russian press focuses so much attention on immigration problems in the States, immigration problems in Europe, how the borders, there are people just flooding across the borders in America, and how the same situation in Europe, and even making weird, slightly like great replacement theory insinuations in some of their programming. I digress. The same situation is here in Russia, and for most people, it's not a huge problem. But there is a very solid core of individuals here in Russia who are not happy with the migrant situation. Or even if they're not maybe unhappy with it, they aren't fans of how many migrants live here. They would like to see them better adapted, which I understand. But there's a lot of them, and I see a lot of reactions, and I see a lot of chatter online connected to the migrant situation. And a lot of it is, well, it's similar to what you might see in the States and in Europe. It is, let's close the borders, let's send them back, let's get them out of here. This is our country. And again, and then some stuff like the Great Replacement Theory, where they are watering down our genetics. They're replacing, there's literally like conversations of Central Asians replacing Russians. And which in Russia is kind of true because of, demographics. But again, I digress. What is interesting is that the politicians, in a show of populism, jumped on the migration topic in the wake of the terrorist attack. And they began putting forth ideas about new legislation that they might enact. What is, I think, important to note is there is already so much migration legislation here in Russia, it's kind of ridiculous. I know because I've had to go through it, and I am currently going through it, and it's not easy. To be sure, Central Asians, especially those from countries like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and I do believe Tajikistan, they have a much simpler method of coming to Russia. They're allowed to work here. It's a thing. But there are still rules and regulations that they must follow, and the problem ultimately is not that there aren't enough migrant laws, it's that nobody is actually enforcing them. In the wake of the terrorist attacks, to just sort of put this into context, one of the things that migrants a lot of times have to do in order to get documents is they have to pass a Russian language exam. In fact, Russian language, history, and legislation, like basic knowledge of the things that are expected of you if you wish to be part of Russian culture. And I mean, I've taken it, and I would say for me, the language part was fine, whatever. But especially the history and the legislation part, you actually have to prepare for it. And to be real, I prepared for the history part, and I still was caught off guard with some of those questions. Like some stuff they wanted me to know about Suvorov. No way. Anyway, turns out, surprise, surprise, that they recently discovered that there was an organization here in Moscow where if somebody didn't pass the exam, if they just paid 15,000 rubles, they got the document saying that they passed the exam. Corruption. Hey, once again. In addition to that, there was a story, and I don't remember which region this was in, and I'm not going to go back and look it up right now. There was a story about a police officer that was arrested because it turned out that he had been registering migrants in like a single apartment that I guess he owned, and there was something like 300 migrants registered in that one apartment. For those of you who don't know how this works in Russia, in order to live and stay in Russia, you have to be registered to a house, to a place where you're living. And in theory, you would be registered to the place where you live. However, a lot of migrant workers don't actually have homes. They either live in hostels or they live in barracks connected to construction areas, but they still have to have a registration somewhere. Otherwise, their documents are not in order and they can be deported or they can pay a fine. So we have a situation where a police officer was just registering them en masse to one location. The documents that could be bought, the registrations that can be bought, these are not standalone instances. And in fact, I know for years that it has been possible for people to buy registrations in Moscow, right? I remember when I first moved here way back in the day, there were people handing out leaflets on the street with advertising those services. So this is not something new. This has been going on for a very long time, and it just has never been fixed. So the problem with migration in Russia is not that there aren't enough laws, it's that the pre-existing laws are not adhered to, and for that reason, they don't work. So ultimately, maybe we'll see some changes to how the migration services and the police forces approach the implementation of these pre-existing laws. However, I do believe that once things quiet back down a little bit, we will just go back to the status quo. A lot of that has to do with the fact that despite what some people might say, migrant workers are a vital part of the Russian economy. Without them, especially now in the time of Russia's special military operation, a lot of the jobs just wouldn't be done. Case in point, in Dagestan, right, which I mentioned where the counterterrorism operation was happening, after that counterterrorism operation happened in the capital of Makhachkala, the police rounded up all the Tajik nationals and brought them in for questioning. The Tajik nationals were the ones who took out the trash. They were responsible for garbage disposal. And for multiple days, while the police were holding all the Tajik nationals to find out if there were any other connections to terrorism, the trash in Makhachkala began to pile up because they are the only ones who deal with that. Construction is largely the same way, just cleaning up anything in the city. All of those low-level jobs, which again, if you look at the United States and you look at Europe, it's the exact same scenario. All of those low-level jobs that other people are not interested in doing because they are considered dirty or below the normal citizenship or citizenry, or not well paying, those get passed on to the migrant workers who are happy to do them because it's better paying than they have in their country. That's just the way the world works these days. And so I imagine, like I said, that once things settle down here, we're going to go back to the status quo because Russia currently does not have the manpower to even operate some of its factories at full capacity, let alone find enough Russian citizens to take out the trash. I guess it's news, but, it kind of happens all the time now. More drone attacks here in Russia. One of the big ones this last week was in Tatarstan, in the region where Kazan is. The reason this was big news is because it was 1,200 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, and people were freaking out. They were trying to figure how could a drone get this far into Russian territory? Was it launched from inside Russia, or was it launched from Central Asia, maybe Kazakhstan? Like a day or two before, though, the Ukrainian one of the Ukrainian ministers or politicians gave her an interview where he was talking about how they have new drones that are capable of flying over 1,000 kilometers. So maybe it was just launched from Ukraine. I don't know. Anyway, it does have people agitated because with this new attack, especially if it was launched from Ukraine, it does push the radius of potential targets that much further out. And it means that a lot of the factories and the oil refineries that before were considered more or less safe are maybe not so right now. In addition to that, at the end of last week or early in the weekend, there was another drone attack, 3 of them simultaneously overnight, and they were all targeting Air Force bases with, I don't know how many, but from what I heard, 6, maybe 7 Russian military aircraft destroyed. So the drone attacks are continuing. They are, I guess, hitting some of their targets. And even though you would think that we've maybe adapted to them, because the targets are relatively high profile and economically or militarily important, they do still make waves here. What I can say is that the situation in Belgorod is almost completely forgotten. Just this last week, there was a situation when some Ukrainian soldiers went on to internationally recognized Russian territory, right? The Belgorod Oblast, and attempted to take control of a small settlement there. That basically got no coverage. There was literally a situation where soldiers were on, again, internationally recognized Russian territory, and just nobody was talking about it. So I know this isn't the first time that has happened, but that whole situation with Belgorod is just being ignored, and yeah, that's the state of things right now. All right. This has been going on long enough. Haven't been going as rapid fire as I normally am, partly because I started to record this and then it turns out my computer wasn't recording, so I had to go back and record all of it, and that sucks. So we're coming up to the last few things here. I'm going to try to breeze through them as quickly as possible. First up has to do with prisons, and actually how some prisons in Russia are closing because there aren't enough prisoners, because they signed contracts to go fight in the war en masse in order to then get pardons. So yeah, kind of an interesting little thing. Although from what we've seen, a lot of the former prisoners, when they are, off the front lines and back in civilian life, there have been quite a few of them had committed crimes that will see them put right back into prison. Unfortunately, though, a lot of those crimes do seem to be connected to murder. This last week, there was a lot of noise connected to speeches given by the two heads of state, which would be Vladimir Putin and Mikhail Mishustin. I'm not really going to say anything about that. Mishustin's whole speech was just applauding how well the Russian government was working, and Putin's whole speech was basically a bunch of promises about how everything is great right now, but it's going to be even better in the future. The same promises, like almost literally the exact same promises that he's been making for the last 15 years. So just political BS and really nothing to cover there. Okay, so in terms of economics, we got a report from Forbes, if I remember correctly, that Russian billionaires actually have gotten richer, and there's actually more of them now than there were in the past, which is, on the one hand, not surprising, but I also think it's important to highlight that every single time as an American I hear something about war, there's always insinuations made of how the United States profits off of war. And you know what? That is true to some degree. But this right here is literal evidence that it's true in Russia as well. The rich are profiting off of the war in Russia. Politicians are profiting off of the war in Russia. It happens in every country. So I just want to point this out because I get a little tired of being told something I already know, the U.S. profits off of war, when the exact same thing is true of Russia, right? It happens everywhere. Also, yeah, the rich are getting richer here. The middle class is disappearing, and the poor, I guess, are actually doing okay if they sign contracts with the military. As long as they don't get killed, they'll be better off for the time being. Speaking of people signing contracts, there was another statistic released. I don't remember. It's like 2.6 maybe. Unemployment rate is at another record low. Sounds awesome. But as I mentioned before, there aren't enough people to fulfill jobs that are needed. Even with migrant workers, there are still shortages. Just this last week, I saw a report that delivery services, right, couriers, there just aren't enough of them. Part of that might have to do with the fact that after the terror attack, some of the Central Asian workers just got out of here because they were worried about harassment or whatever. Some of them have been leaving since the start of the war because salaries have been decreasing as the value of the ruble has been decreasing. But regardless, there are shortages in pretty much every single sector of the economy right now. So even though unemployment is at record lows, that's not necessarily a good thing. There just aren't people to work the jobs. However, in the Russian region of Tatarstan, which I mentioned just a little bit ago, where that drone strike was, the 1,200-kilometer one, the local or the regional government has come up with kind of a novel way of fixing the shortage of workers in the factories. What they are recommending to be done is allow 16 to 18-year-olds to go work in the factories and other high-risk jobs that are currently prohibited by law. The reasoning is that it'll give them good employment opportunities in the future, and that it's like an internship basically. But again, dangerous manual labor is prohibited for under 18-year-olds by Russian law, just like it is in a lot of countries, right? There are child labor laws for a reason. In fact, the worker shortage has gotten so bad that it doesn't just affect factories, it even seems to be affecting the security forces. I read a report, or I guess a little blurb, which said that if it hasn't already happened, it is almost certainly going to happen in the near future, where people connected to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, like the police apparatus, the prosecutors, the state prosecutors, and the FSB, among other agencies, that people will not be able to quit or retire because there aren't enough people to fill those agencies either. Part of that has to do with the fact that, like, for example, in the FSB, a large number of those officers were sent off to the war. And so their numbers have thinned considerably. And then in other situations, they just have an increased workload. I don't really know why. Maybe because all of these discrediting cases that are being pushed through the legal system. Regardless, the number or the amount of workload that the other security forces are having to deal with has increased to a point where even the numbers that they had in the past aren't able to deal with just what they're having to deal with. For the last few years now, especially since Western sanctions and payment systems and all that have kind of been shuttered here in Russia, the Russian government has really been pushing its own payment system, Mir. And for a number of years, especially during COVID, it was expanding and pushing out into more countries like Turkey and Central Asia, even into, or potentially into areas of Southeast Asia. All of that has kind of fallen apart. And with the last few years, it has shrunk. The map of which countries accept Mir has gotten smaller and smaller. And then I think this last week we may have heard the final death toll, the death bell of the Mir payment system, because currently the only two countries that are accepting it for payments, Kazakhstan and Belarus, which are in with Russia together in a economic union. So like a lot of their economic things are connected. But Uzbekistan, a lot of the other Central Asian countries have cut off all payments. You can still take money out of the bank with your Mir card, but you can't like pay for things in the shops. You can't, or in restaurants, really anywhere. And the reason for this is because they are worried about secondary sanctions against their own banking sectors. So it is possible that in the future, when the threat of secondary sanctions is no longer hanging over countries' heads, that maybe the Mir payment system will come back. But at that point in time, I think Russians, if they're able to, will just gladly go back to Visa and MasterCard, which they'll be able to use anywhere around the world. Whereas the Mir payment system really only works in Russia's immediate backyard, or worked. And last up here, this is it. This is the end. A few weeks back, Putin gave this speech where he outlined, maybe it was a month ago already. Anyway, he outlined all of these plans that he made. He was going to, they were going to increase spending in all of these branches of social life in order to make life here in Russia better. And one of the things that he said was he wanted families with 3 or more children to all be above the poverty level. And this week, somebody at the Russian Academy of Sciences sat down and actually did some figuring as to how much money the government is going to need to throw at this problem. And the figure is 280 billion rubles per year in order to bring all families with more than 3 children above the poverty level. We'll see if it happens. Putin has said that the goal is by 2030, so we have 6 years. But based on government expenses currently and projected forecasts and just a lot of other stuff, I feel like this is one of those promises that just might not get fulfilled. Well, there you have it. Like I said, it's been a while, so there was kind of a lot to go through. Also, there kind of wasn't all that much to go through. It was just a lot of small stuff. I had been taking notes for the last week and a half, and I just remember looking at them and thinking, like, there's a lot here, but none of it actually feels all that important. Again, though, right, it's all in the details. You start seeing the bigger picture emerge, and I hope that if you've been following these updates that I've been doing, you start to see connections. Like, you start to hear about certain things over and over again, and you might start to see trends emerge, or you might start to realize that you might start to realize things, whatever they might be. That's on you. Anyway, yeah, I apologize for the break. Like I said in the beginning, I had some stuff I was just taking care of, getting stuff in order here. Also, the weather at the beginning of last week, like a week ago, was just fantastic. I took a bike ride. I was just out. It was great. But yeah, I'm back. I will plan on doing this again here in a few days so that the video is not like over 30 minutes long, which I'm sure this one already is. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this rambly version of what's been happening in Russia. Comments, questions, leave a like, do all that stuff. I will wrap it up here, let you all get on with your days or on to the next YouTube video, whatever it is you're going to do. So this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.